Huey Long on the left. We've seen the antecedents of today's Wingnuts at various times with varying degrees of violence. I mean, we experienced in the late 1960s, early 1970s. People forget that a lot of the far left activist groups, we traced down and researched this book, more than 1,000 cases of shootings, arsons, and bombings from the far left in one period of American history. And then, of course, we all know more recently the violence that came out of the militia movement in the 1990s.
Do you think Wingnuts today are more dangerous than they were in decades past?
I do, because they've increased their prominence and their credibility. I think there are three reasons why today's Wingnuts are more dangerous than folks we've seen before. First of all, Wingnuts are sometimes dismissed as the eccentric color on the fringes of the political landscape. Sort of harmless, and in some cases they are. But three things have made them more dangerous than ever before, and more powerful than ever before. One, the polarization of the parties. The parties are more polarized than ever before. It's not just your imagination, folks. Washington, if you used to look at voting patterns in Congress, the power was clustered in the center of Congress. Well, now it's in the extremes. What that does is that increases the influence of folks on the extremes. We've had a rigged system of redistricting in this country, which has also moved power from the center to the margins. Folks are trying to get elected in supposedly safe seats where there's no general election in a closed partisan primary with a 10% turnout, which is entirely realistic. 5.1% makes a majority. Second thing is the polarization of the partisan media. Increasingly, we're kind of devolving back to the era where newspapers used to be owned by political parties, except now it's radio stations, television stations, as well as newspapers. And then finally, the really new thing under the sun is the internet. The internet has, in some cases, become an incubator for extremism. It's become a method by which people recruit and radicalize, where people talk to each other all day long and incite each other to greater extremes. And it's enabled something where we're self-segregating ourselves into separate political realities. And that can be very dangerous.
As it was talk more about the media and the internet in the few minutes ahead, but let's first of all identify and get you to explain two syndromes that you talk about in the book. Bush derangement syndrome, obviously, which was first formed during the Bush administration, and now Obama derangement syndrome. What are they? How do they? What gave rise to them, and how are they manifest in today's political climate?
It is an apparently contagious political virus. Bush derangement syndrome and Obama derangement syndrome now, I define as pathological hatred of the president posing as patriotism. And it's important to understand the interplay between the extremes, because neither side is immune from this. In the Bush years, what do we see? We saw people, some protesters, not maybe a lot, but definitely there, and some very prominent ones, comparing President Bush to Hitler, calling him a tyrant, a terrorist. And this just wasn't placards in protest. One of the things I detail in the book, I mean, there's a surprising line of Nobel Prize winners who are comparing Bush to Hitler and the Bush administration to fascists. And they didn't get a lot of condemnation. And politics follows the lines of physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. And one of the things, whenever I interview someone at a protest carrying an Obama is Hitler sign, invariably they say is, well, they started it. They called our guy Hitler first, and I didn't see anyone complaining, so now we're just getting back at him. So the extremes do incite each other. But now what I think we've seen with Obama is something that's even more prevalent. It's metastasized in our body politic much quicker. The Obama resistance was announced on literally day one, I detail in my book. The websites came out calling for the Obama resistance. We saw a major uptick in death threats against the president right after Election Day through his first quarter. It was at a much higher level than previously. And of course, as we followed the protests last year, I think it's very important to say that the Tea Party protests I do not consider a wingnut movement at all. But I think there are two main strains going on. One, you've got a principled fiscal conservative protest in reaction to bailouts and unprecedented budget deficits. But then you've got the folks who suffer from serious cases of Obama derangement syndrome. And they, over the course of the summer in particular, as conservative activists, ironically, started riffing off Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals and embracing, street theater confrontation politics. Obama derangement syndrome became prevalent, and it degrades our discourse.
So there was, and I'm not going to say that it was across the political spectrum, but there did seem to be a moment right around the election where the country became unified around this idea of something completely different in the political spectrum when President Obama was elected. What happened?
We were young ones. It is amazing to look back at the 2008 election, and let's look at it dispassionately for a second. Let's look at the numbers. It's important to remember that President Obama won not only 90% of liberals, but 60% of centrists and even 20% of conservatives. Hard to believe. He won independents by an 8-point margin. 53% of the vote doesn't sound like much, but it was more than any presidential candidate in 20 years, and more than any Democrat except LBJ and FDR. So you had a country that was sending a pretty decisive message, at least in context of our recent politics. And it was a clear rejection of President Bush's play-to-the-base politics. Both McCain and Obama won their nominations by campaigning against the polarizing play-to-base establishment of their parties. And then, despite American people sending what I think is a clear message, our politics got hijacked very quickly by the extremes in both parties who are invested personally and professionally in play-to-the-base politics. They like it. They profit from it, professionally or personally. And they wanted to perpetuate it by any means necessary.
You suggest in the book that there may be some racial tone to all of this as well. You say, quote, the presence of the first African-American president is driving another anxiety, the change from a traditionally white to minority-led federal government. How much do you think race plays into all of this?
I do not think that the vast majority of opposition to President Obama is about simple racism. As President Obama has joked, he was black before the election. He won his first key victory was in Iowa, a state that's 96% white. We are a long way as a country from the simple, stupid, brutal racism of the Bull Connor era. That said, I don't think you can seriously analyze American politics without taking race into account. Slavery is the original sin of this country. We've always wrestled with it. Race has been a fundamental fault line in our politics forever. And as I interviewed folks in the field at protests, I started trying to figure out what it was. And you start hearing a lot of numbers, a lot of dates. Date 2042 and 2050 came up. Well, those are the dates where the census estimates that America will have a non-white majority. And I think rather than looking to simple racism, which is a reflexive trick by some on the far left, which I think reduces credibility at times, I think it's worth looking at something more complex. I think that we are seeing and witnessing the birth of white minority politics. It is a politics of anxiety about change. If you look at the way that many of the protesters sort of wrap themselves up in Revolutionary War iconography, they really believe on a visceral level that they are defending their heritage that is under threat from this president in the White House. You hear phrases like usurper. You actually, if you comes up a surprising amount when you interview people who are comparing the president to Hitler or Mussolini, is very often they'll say, well, my country's been here for X generations. They're big on saying how long their family's been in this country. And there's a sense that there's a simpler America that is being complicated or outright usurped by this president. And it's part of a hangover from the late 60s, I believe, an association with the late 60s, when certain elements of the anti-war movement became seen as anti-American. But they are exaggerated, they're hysterical, and I do think it is a way to account for the role of race without simply dismissing it as racism, because I think our country's better and different than that.
All right. So far, so good with the conversation. You're doing a terrific job.
Thanks, man.
We want to throw the floor open to questions here for a couple of moments now. Because it's on television here, it's on C-SPAN Book TV, we want to make sure we get a microphone in front of you, because rightfully, C-SPAN hates dead air. There's a lady up the front, but the only thing we ask is that you phrase microphone, come on up with the microphone. The only thing we ask is that you form your question in the shape of a question. Tell us your name, where you're from.
My name is Reba Shemansky, and I'm from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I can accept your premise about wingnuts, but I've always referred to them as right-wing nuts, because the truth of the matter is the right-wing zealots, the crackpots, represent far bigger percentage of the Republican Party than they do of the left. On your book, you have Sarah Palin there. Now we have Liz Cheney and her Al-Qaeda 7. There's nobody in the Democratic Party who has that kind of a leadership or could win an election the way they did. And about Bush, Bush earned his hatred because of the criminal tactics he used to steal the election. He was not a majority president. And so how can you call the Democratic Party, which is fairly centrist? There are no Rockefeller Republicans. There are no Javits.
All right. Let me just answer the question. It's a perfectly fair point that I get a lot. Here's what I believe. We are not going to stop this cycle of hyper-partisanship that we are in, which is getting increasingly extreme, unless we stand up to extremes on both sides. If we